All right, I'm here today with Tommy from CTMU Singularity, and he's been making videos primarily about Chris Langan's cognitive theoretic model of the universe. It's a theory that I've been interested in for a number of years. I think I first read the CTMU back in 2012, and I didn't understand all of it. Since then, I've read some of his other papers, especially his 2019 paper on quantum mechanics, and I've gotten a better grasp of what Langan is ultimately getting at. But I haven't been looking at him lately. Tommy, of course, has. So I'd like to interview Tommy about the CTMU, also sort of his own worldview. So I guess first, why don't you introduce yourself? Why did you get interested in this? What do you find of value in the CTMU, etc.?
Yeah, I'm Tommy. I'm a sophomore in high school. I really got interested in the CTMU around 2 years ago, and I think it provides a lot of what you've talked about in your discourse and presentations is having an integrated idealist Platonic metaphysical framework that's able to explain the observations of science and connect how we explain the world with the real universe, and the way that it does that is through elucidating the relationship between mind and reality and showing that these are not two separate things but are actually quite related and share common structure. So the way that I see it is that it's really the only way that you're going to be able to have an integrated worldview and a general way of looking at the world. And I generally think that it's better to have true ways of looking at the world than false ones, is through like rigid technical detail explaining and explicating that relationship. And that's what the CTMU does. I've had my channel for a little bit over a year, and most of my presentations have been on the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, which relates again our cognitive theory to the universe, and thus we're able to is able to provide a firm grounding for the things which I'm really interested in, which is philosophy, theology, science, and it's like fertile and well aerated soil through which all those different disciplines can spread.
Right. So, what would you say are the main concepts from the CTMU?
Yeah, so the main concepts are what's called the three M's, which are three tautological principles, which are essentially, it starts with the reality principle, which says reality consists of all and only reality, which means that the you know we reality is entirely self-contained. And then we can take that one step further through metaphysical ontology principle, which means basically reality describes itself. So because it's self-contained and there's nothing outside of reality that can affect it in any way whatsoever, reality has to be self-contained, self-creating, self-explaining, self-sustaining. And it actually takes a great deal of involvement with reality, and it has to have all of these different faculties, which include self-cognition, the capacity to process and integrate information in its structure and evolution. It has to have the it has to have this kind of self-similar rules and structure. And so that's where you get the next two principles. You have the metaphysical ontology principle, you have mind equals reality principle, which says that reality and mind share common structure and are inseparable. They're basically two ways of talking about one and the same thing. And you have multiplex unity, which is actually a term borrowed from a book called Neoplatonism and Christianity, which you might be interested in. Is But basically, what that says is that there's this self-distributed syntax, the same rules and structure apply to everything in reality, and so everything is related to the ultimate identity, just as the ultimate identity inheres within every little part and parcel of reality. So you have this intrinsic connectivity, and that serves to have the universe exist like a mind. And you have this third aspect, which is that that mind has to be able to create and ascribe existence to itself in order such that the whole system coheres.
Right. So, Langan uses some kind of transcendental argumentative methods, basically looking at what are the necessary properties that reality must have so that it's intelligible to us, and then what can we kind of derive from those properties, and how can we characterize the nature of reality in light of that. So, what more would you say about kind of Langan's method of argument? He claims to bridge the phenomenal noumenal gap, correcting Kant. So how does he affect that? How does Langan ground his own conclusions?
Yeah, so basically, the two things which the CTMU is said to be induced from is perception and cognition. And these two things can be deduced through kind of the large scale structure of the universe, which is what John Wheeler did, for example, in his participatory universe, where he shows that quantum information has to have a perceiver in order to have any coherent existence. And so the universe is like a self-excited circuit that is parameterizing physics around quantum information, which is that, so it's a kind of a version of the anthropic principle, because it means that the universe selects for things which can observe. So basically the first thing is perception. This is, all the way back to Berkeley. Let's say like esse is percepi, like to be is to be perceived in the mind of the overall reality, and cognition. And the universe is perceiving and seeing itself through the mind of sentient observer participants, such as human beings, such as whichever other life forms exist on Earth and elsewhere. It's like, so those are the two main things. And then you're able to then kind of deduce what a reality has to be like. And you can bridge the phenomenal noumenal gap, is that's basically put within the context of a reality self-simulation, is that there's an intentional aspect of reality, which is like the rules and structure and programming, which is the part of the universe that hides itself. It's like this veil of Maya, in the words of the Hindus, that wants to that is not represented to observer participants. And then there's an external aspect, the extension of reality, which is, and what the CTMU says is that reality's intension and extension are two self-dual elements. They're two ways of looking at the same thing. And so what that means is that essentially the phenomena, the noumena, the things in themselves, is this kind of universal distributed form which is everywhere within reality, and and so that's the display of the and so that's the programming domain of the self-simulation, the non-terminal domain, and then the terminal domain is the phenomena, is the actual perceptual syntax as then applied to our observations.
Can you elaborate on that terminal and non-terminal domains? Where's that vocabulary from?
Yeah, so the terminal and non-terminal, it's a term borrowed from linguistics, from the is that a terminal is essentially a decided linguistic expression. You can, the Noam Chomsky has this idea of transformational linguistics, that you have the non-terminal linguistics, which is essentially this deep structure of language, and then what language is doing is you're applying transformations onto it. And so if reality is a self-synthesizing linguistic system, then essentially that kind of domain of abstract expansive potential is the non-terminal domain, which is, we can get into this with this idea of the syntactic metaverse, which kind of goes beyond Hugh Everett's idea of a multiverse to encompass this space of abstract potential. And then the terminal domain is the actual universe that is instantiated and has more, I guess, ontological reality than this space of alternative potential.
Yeah, very nice. So, how would you relate that to classical notions of actuality and potential? And what are some other kind of analogies to this dual aspect? It reminds one of the kind of implicate order of Bohm versus the explicate order. So, what are some more analogies for this kind of dual aspect of reality?
Yeah, so the this is something I talked about with how the CTMU augments Saint Thomas Aquinas's proof for God by act and potency. Is that it goes beyond that kind of scholastic model and gives logical structure to this idea. Is that anything which exists in potentia has, and then you're acting upon it and brings it into concrete reality, has to have had that reality in the first place in some sort of space of potential. And so Thomas Aquinas uses this as a proof of God, is that there has to be some, not first cause, but kind of what allows for causation to occur. And then and so the idea with that is there's this telic recursion whereby the potency, the potential, is the non-terminal domain, and that is constantly interfacing with actuality in order such that it can generate new timelines for the existence and evolution of the universe. And so the universe is constantly adapting on the fly to freely changing internal conditions in order such that it can evolve itself. And it does this through that Newman phenomena divide. Is that it's essentially a self simulation which is using what's called telic recursion in order to evolve according to this kind of generalized teleology, which is conceived as the self-identification of the reality system through identification operators such as human beings, other and conscious agents, which it's and we are then secondary tellers, meaning, God or the global operator descriptor has the ultimate power to affect, telic recursion and the way things work out in the universe, but that authority is shared with us in a certain sense, and we're secondary telic identification operators, and we are able to, in a limited way, use our free will and the freedom that we inherit from the reality system, which has to be free because there's nothing external to it to determine it. We inherit that as secondary images of that ultimate reality, and then we are able to participate in this self-simulation for the betterment or improvement of the reality system.
Right. So it might not be obvious why the teleological and syntactic elements are joined. I think actually Schopenhauer is sort of helpful here. We're talking essentially about the phenomenal noumenal divide. There is this intentional, noumenal, kind of underlying structural aspect of reality, and then there is the extensional, phenomenal, explicit, conscious aspect of reality, and the bottom aspect that kind of runs classical reality has to bootstrap itself. So how does that go about? What do we regress to, like as Schopenhauer is looking through in his system the various aspects of the transcendental aesthetic, the way that phenomenal reality presents itself? He can't ground one set of like syntactic relations in the world in another set of syntactic relations. That has to ground out at something that is pre-representational, right? It's not something that we can find in the field of representation. It has to be what underlies our field of representation. And Schopenhauer, through a kind of phenomenological analysis and like thinking by analogy, uh, of ourselves and of physical systems, and the sort of similarity we see between our attraction and repulsion to things and then attraction and repulsion in the world, he concludes that this noumenon is what we identify ultimately in ourselves as the will. I'm pretty sure that Langan is sympathetic to that notion. But let's explore that a little bit further. So, another place this duality appears is in quantum mechanics. We have the classical world and the quantum world. One has particles in definite locations in space and time. The other characterizes a kind of superposition of possible positions for those particles. So, how does Langan treat that kind of quantum dichotomy in light of what we've said about intentionality, extensionality, etc.?
Yeah, and you'll have to guide me hopefully if I butcher some of Schopenhauer, because you're more knowledgeable in that domain than I am. But what I'd say with regard to quantum mechanics is that Langan has had the way that he models Telic recursion is based on the ideas of the quantum wave function collapse. Is that you have is he essentially breaks that down into two phases. That you have the is that you have inner expansion, which is essentially corresponding to when the quantum particle becomes a probability distribution and doesn't really have any definite position or momentum, but has the but it exists in this kind of space of potential. And then requantization, which is when there's this registration event, which then causes it to have a definite position and momentum and to act more like a classical particle. And so the idea with that is that that is literally a process of Telic recursion, and it's also an analogy for how it works at the broader scale. So that's a tertiary Telic recursion is just literally like one tiny quantum particle, and how it and that system and how it evolves over time. But then also, so you can think of the inner expansion as a potentiality growing to encompass the non-terminal domain, this space of potential that has the possibility of becoming any possible end, which is then filtered through the syntax, through the rules of reality, in order to generate the next terminal state, which is then, and the way it does that is through that collapse, as there has to be information provided to it in order for it to determine its next state. And this relates to Schopenhauer, from my understanding, which is literally just based on the title of his book, but of will and representation, is that the will essentially would be the way that that the universe the will is essentially the primary and secondary tellers. So that's God and humans, which has this input into the system, which determines how it evolves and parameterizes the structure and dynamics of reality. And then the representation would be just the terminal domain. That's the classical world. That's what we see. And the ultimate basis for this is actually something that is pre-will and pre-representation, is that what's called unbound telesis, is literally infinite will, is will without any informational constraint. And that represents the pre-material basis of reality, which is then, through recursive cross definition over time, through Telic recursion, then filters itself into a specific universe.
Right, that would be like the will in itself, or in Hinduism, Brahman as the absolute, versus the secondary teller aspect being our will related to our representations, because there is a real dynamic interface between will and representation, and yet there's this kind of absolute aspect of will in itself behind it. But in Hinduism, that would be like our Atman, which is Brahman, which is connected to that universal source, but our Atman insofar as that Atman is connected to our particular jiva or particular soul, and how that's then joined to the world of phenomenal reality and Maya and all that. So, what about implications then for spirituality? Langan has posted on X and on Facebook many like pro-Christian kind of sympathetic messages, although he hasn't really explicitly identified as a Christian. What are some of the similarities there as far as notions of salvation, eschatology, and things like that?
Yeah, I think that the CTMU could be properly termed as a Christian metaphysic, but I think it could also be termed, and I've written about this I'm writing a book length length document about that right now is that you can also think of it as a Hindu or a Muslim or a Jewish metaphysic. It's a meta religion, and it provides the grounding for all of these different things. The main reason, well, I think it's closest to Christianity, because, and this is what Langan says, is that it's a meta religion that faithfully mirrors the structure of Christianity. And the reason why Langan, I think, believes that, and I don't want to speak for him, but is that Jesus in particular is a universal religious figure, which ought to be recognized as such, as kind of the ideal of human perfection. And the Logos made flesh is that we are somehow able to participate through that particular figure in the metalinguistic identity of reality. And so that's really what the main advancement of Christian metaphysics is this idea of, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And that encapsulates exactly what the CTMU says, is that there's this self-processing, self-configuring language, which is the ultimate identity of everything in the world, and that is the ultimate thing. So according to the CTMU, even if you take away everything historically about Jesus, even if he never existed, what he would still represent in the current day is the ideal of human perfection, the gateway to human salvation, and the Logos made flesh. And so that encapsulates two really important concepts in the CTMU, which is teleology and the self-configuring, self-processing language. And so I think that's the reason why that's given more precedence than others. But to take your previous tag there, he's also said similar things about Hinduism. He says that he says that the CTMU is Brahman. It is Brahman, it is moksha, it is Atman, it is all of these things combined. It is, so basically what that's describing is the self-duality between secondary and primary tellers, and that those are actually share in one identity. And we have our Atman is separate from God because we are bound to a particular terminal body, and thus kind of aren't able to see the whole picture and are able to make free choices on that behalf for the further self-identification of Brahman. And so I think Christianity has been stressed the most, but I think that there are a number of religious frameworks which you could apply the CTMU to fundamental concepts.
Yeah, it's like a kind of perennialist approach to religion, generally. But it's interesting that there is this kind of Christian element, and the idea of the Logos is an intriguing idea. You know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, which kind of raises this question that I have, and I'm not sure how Langan addresses this. It kind of moves more towards the Platonic side of things. Well, we've said there is the will in itself, this unbounded telesis, the primary teller as well. It's like a manifestation of that. And then on the other side, I wonder, is there like the extensional realm in itself, like the fully realized, rather than like the seminally potential and pure potential? Is there the fully actual that contains all of the eternal forms, all of the kind of fully spelled out logical implications that this whole process of Telic recursion and kind of discovering the nature of this underlying syntax that we're going through, like, is there an endpoint that that's all reaching towards? And what is that thing? Is that distinct from the primary teller? Or is that like out at the end of time, kind of guiding us from there? Or what? How do we deal with the word in itself?
Yeah, I would say that as opposed to unbound telesis, which is totally unembodied, and if you that in itself would be the actual world, which contains all of the Platonic forms as a universal distributed form that inheres in every part of reality. So this abstract reality is not part of an ideal world above, but is coupled and self-dual with every single representation in the world. And so, in a sense, the even though it's been bound, even it still contains that original primordial will, which is then embodied in this world of forms, which is essentially the structure, could essentially be modeled as like the structures of the non-terminal domain. And you can do similar things psychologically for archetypes, is that abstract ideal reality and that reality syntax is embedded within every expression of reality that happens to actually exist in the physical universe. And then what was the second part of the question?
Just how do we deal with that notion of the word in itself, right? And also, I'd like to just get clarification on how unbounded telesis relates to the primary telor. Are these the same thing in some sense, or how are they distinguished?
Yeah, I would say that unbound, that basically the primary teller has two aspects. Is one of them is unbound telesis, which is this space of infinite expansive potential. One of them is bound telesis, which is that potential which has then been acted upon to concretely realize something, and then the relationship between those two. And so I think that's another reason why Christian theology is sometimes stressed, because that seems to be sort of a model of Trinitarian theology, is that you have a creator, which is essentially the abstract transcendental version of aspect of God, and then you have the creation, which is the concrete, actualized God, God made flesh. It's a little more involved than that, but that's what that represents. And then you have the relationship between those two, and the relationship between potency and actuality is governed by telic recursion, which is this continual self-optimative property of reality, whereby it reaches towards further self-identification.
Right. So when you take that telic recursion to the limit, and God kind of fully realizes himself, does Langan then suppose the existence of an eternal, omniscient, effectively omnipotent mind because it contains the seeds of all form, in fact, all form in itself? So does that exist, this kind of infinite mind, as well as like the potential for all form? Does the fully actualized mind exist for Langan?
Yeah, well, I think that exists. This is something that Edgar Allan Poe wrote this essay Eureka back in the 1850s, called subtitled "An Essay on the Material and Spiritual Universe." And basically, I think his idea is consistent with what the CTMU would say on this topic, is that the universe in some way is reaching towards the fullest self-knowledge and self-expression. And once it does that, and that might not be a temporal thing, that might just be that there's this constant recursive algorithm whereby new universes are generated from the seed of a fully self-actualized reality. And so you have something, sort of a metaphysical analog of, I don't know if you know, Roger Penrose's idea of conformal cyclic cosmology, is that the universe is continually expanding, not in the physical sense, but in this kind of metaphysical sense of it's representing itself for its self-identification. And then once it achieves that, maybe in however many quintillion years, and it's fully recognized in all, by all, and as all in every part of the material world, and there's this full self-knowledge, and then the universe is then there's a new universe, which is, basically everything emanates from the primary teller and then flows back, and that's not a one-time process like it is in, strands of, Big Crunch, or even, Christian eschatology, but it's actually something that's continually happening, is that the world is that there could even be other terminal domains in which the self-identification of the primary teller is being recursively run.
Right. As far as I understand, Penrose's model is geometrical, essentially, where the topology of the end state of the entropic death of the universe becomes isometric to a singularity at the beginning. And so then we just have this overlap, essentially, that the end state is mathematically indistinguishable from the start state of a universe. And Penrose even talks about the possibility that like advanced civilizations that span one universe might decide to engineer the large scale structure or distribution of matter in order that when this transition from the end state to the start state takes place, messages are somehow encoded. And so Penrose suggests that we could look at the distribution of galaxies and such as evidence for a pre-cosmic civilization that existed at some other time. But you're saying also that perhaps in parallel, these other iterations of this Telic recursion process are taking place, maybe infinitely many of them, something like that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Penrose's idea struck. Well, first of all, I would say that if there were an advanced civilization which has this encoded information from one universe to another, that would necessarily be, fully part of the primary teller and would not have any of current current informational patterns or like separate existence, and would just be kind of encoded as learned information into the new universe. And I'm speculating here. This isn't anything which I believe has been published on, but and then a lot of Penrose's problems, from what I've heard him speak, and I read recently his book, which he didn't touch on this too much, but I read The Emperor's New Mind, is that there's this problem of entropy coming in from the previous universe. Is that we have this problem of if we have a highly disordered state at the beginning of the universe with this cosmic microwave background radiation, how do we have any semblance of like order in the universe? And so he, I guess, kind of posits that negative entropy, that which I think he portmanteaus into neg entropy, is carried over in some way from the previous universe as kind of distributed potential, which then orders the early universe such that it can create stars and galaxies and whatnot, and ultimately lead to the kind of immaculate order that we see in the universe. But what the CTMU says, that neg entropy, that is essentially entropy, that idea that delta S is always greater than or equal to 0. There's always going to be increasing entropy in a closed system, is only confined to the terminal domain. Whereas there's this non-terminal domain which is generating new timelines for the further complexification and creative evolution of the universe, which is counteracting that intrinsic tendency to disorder through the large scale evolution. So you can have things which appear random and disconnected, but then ultimately you have the expression and representation of a coherent reality through that.
So, does the extensional domain only exist from the perspective of secondary tellers? Is it, in other words, anthropic?
Yeah, because I think that the extensional domain, the terminal domain, only exists. It's back to the Vedic idea of like Maya, is that it's a material reality, but it's actually a self-contraction of the ultimate reality, of which is the way that the primary teller would perceive things, which is taking all of these perspectives across time from all of these different secondary tellers who are immersed in Maya, who are immersed in the illusion, essentially, of material reality. But that's but the god, the primary teller, is not, it is not itself, it is not terminal, it's non-terminal, because there's no actual physical embodiment or like seeing or thinking about one particular thing. It's a more general process.
Right. So that would actually coincide with what Stephen Wolfram has said recently about the emergence of physical laws. The question that Penrose raises with entropy is, okay, we have this general tendency that entropy always increases, yet why was it so small right at the beginning? There's no explanation for that. Wolfram goes for the idea that we perceive the laws of physics that are consistent with us as observers. And so entropy then is a necessary kind of anthropically derived characteristic of our universe because, and I've actually speculated on this myself before I learned that Wolfram was talking about it, that we have to have entropy work the way it does in order for memory to work. Because if there was this kind of or rather symmetry in both directions in time, then we couldn't deduce like facts about the past from the present as reliably. So yeah, that's an interesting idea that physics is in some sense derived from our nature as observer. Um, what's the guy's name? There's a book called Physics from Fisher Information by uh, Freeman, I think. Anyway, he's still living. He's like 90 something. So if anyone wants to interview him or talk to him, better do it quickly. Um, but yeah, he talks about how Fisher information is this kind of statistical tool that's used in experimental design. And if you take the mathematics of Fisher information and do some like math magic with it, you can derive all of the physics of relativity, of quantum mechanics, everything else that we see. Um, but yeah, this idea that like how does the projection of the world actually take place? In Hinduism, in some sense, we are that which projects the world, but also there's higher organizing intelligences that guide the mutual projection of the world. It's not like we're all solipsistically creating our own laws of nature and the nature of the overall cosmos. We do that guided by higher forces. So what about that aspect of things? What about higher minds besides just the primary teller? What is there between the primary teller and secondary tellers? Higher intelligences, perhaps, that in principle have access to what's happening here, because that's clearly evident in Platonism. The creation of the world is not just the cooperation between the one and souls. There are all those levels in between, the intellectual gods, hypercosmic gods, forces like that. I'm pretty sure I've seen Langan mention the idea of the egregore, or these kind of collective spiritual entities. Not sure about that, but yeah, what does Langan say about these intermediate levels, and how do they also kind of guide the evolution of the cosmos?
Yeah, so take that one point at a time, because it leads one into the next from that. So Stephen Wolfram had, I think his idea would correspond with the CTMU, but it actually takes it one step further, because it's saying that that not only is our perceptual syntax in line with the universe, and the reason is because we are perceptual agents, and it's not like we're just blind to other realities, but the universe is actually parameterized around our cognition and perception. And so that's the John Wheeler's idea of the self-excited circuit, is that you start with observer participants who then provide quantum information to the system. That quantum information determines physics, which then determines how observer participants come about, and it's this closed loop that leads to further and further observer participation. And so there's this idea of distributed solipsism in the CTMU, is that there's one ultimate identity, and then that is distributed among all of the secondary tellers in a way kind of similar to like the Brahman versus Atman dynamic, is that they are ultimately one, but there's this self-duality whereby one is immersed in material reality and the other is not. And then in between God and humans, you actually do have those kind of higher intelligences, which are these ideas of like primary telic recursive parameters, is that these are like the items on God's will, is that are then determining the derivation and evolution of the future of the universe. And so God, this is like it, in the Bible it talks about the divine council or the sons of God, is that God is sharing his authority with these kind of overall powers of creation. You can call that, higher intelligences, you can call that like lowercase g gods. But there is some way in which they're they're actually, I think the closest would be kind of like angels, is that they have a specific functionality and limited degrees of free will, but are there's kind of this distributed fine tuning of the universe, so that there is that a little bit of freedom inherent in those higher intelligences, such that you don't have a reality that's entirely determined from the top down.
Okay. So, what are some possible scientific implications of those higher parameters? Like I've talked with John Vervaeke before, and he likes the idea of collective intelligence, and I even got him to say there may be a kind of collective intelligence to the cosmos, and if that were the case, we would expect that to be relevant for cosmology. So, what sorts of scientific implications might come out of dealing with these kind of parameters on the primary tellur in our cosmos? How can we look for them?
Yeah, there is that kind of collective intelligence to the cosmos. I'd say the most relevant kind of higher telic recursive parameter is the existence of life. And so what it implies is that life doesn't just originate biologically, but originates metaphysically as kind of an intrinsic drive for the self-recognition of the universe. So I'd say is the most important, because that allows you to kind of bridge scientific Darwinism with certain strands of teleology or intelligent design, is that there is this natural selection, and reality is constantly engaged in this process of self-replication and self-selection, not just at the biological scale but at the cosmic scale. That's basically what telic recursion is doing, but that itself is a process of intelligent design and recursive iteration towards an end. And so that is governed by life as a broad drive of the reality system.
Hmm. So that kind of raises the question, what gets to be a tellur in physical reality and what doesn't? What is like the minimal criteria for being a tellur?
Yeah, so a tellur is defined as a structurally complex syntactor, which is not particularly specific, but the important thing to realize that all tellers are syntactors, but not all syntactors are tellers. So for example, I or you would be a secondary teller and a secondary syntactor, who are both whereas an inanimate object or a particle is a tertiary syntactor, but not a tertiary teller. And so the distinction there, I think, is essentially that of consciousness, and it's kind of a loose line. I'd say the cell, and but it's not. It's not like just human beings are secondary tellers. This goes all the way down to the cells are considered secondary tellers. Basic life forms, but essentially the difference is those first inklings of consciousness and the ability to process information in a way that's not just like a Turing machine where it takes in a string of information and spits out a different one, but it actually has the structural complexity in order to self-model and have consciousness, sentience, and freedom. Essentially, like the atoms in a wall don't have any real freedom. They just have they're just ordered by higher order dynamics. Whoever built the wall, whoever made it such that those materials existed, those are they are simply responding to higher order dynamics in the reality system, whereas the whereas human beings are not determined externally, but are actually intrinsically self-determining and therefore qualify as secondary tellers. But it's kind of a graded scale. It's not. I don't know if there's exactly like a place where you could put it like a pig is, but a chicken isn't, or something.
Hmm. Are there tertiary tellers at all, or it just goes up to secondary and stops?
It just goes up to secondary, because the idea with tellers is that you have this self-duality between the primary teller, the secondary teller, and the relationship between those two, which is both co-inversive, meaning that the primary teller adheres within secondary tellers, and then topological, meaning that, and then descriptive, meaning that secondary tellers are contained within the primary teller, part of which is just the universe. So we're like physically contained, and then so there's this kind of perfect like lock between the two, where that is essentially the idea of CTMU triality. And so tertiary syntactors are essentially, if you think of those two if you think of primary telic recursion and secondary telic recursion as the will, then tertiary syntactors would just be the representation of what's called those higher order teleodynamics.
Mm-hmm. So, looking a little bit closer again at that, what makes a secondary teller, what it is, one way to think about it is like, Leibniz's mill, the thought experiment, where if you had some big mechanism that seemed to be acting like a conscious creature, and you went inside and inspected how it all fits together, you would never get, no matter how complex the machinery was, any explanation of like the oneness of phenomenal experience that we have, or where, like in Plato's definition of self-motion, like, is it that one part moves the other parts? Well, no, the whole has to somehow move itself, because only the one part that is the one that self-moves is the one that's truly self-motive. The rest of the parts would then be alter-motive. So that holistic self-motion can't come from any local place. It has to be distributed in local space. And then the oneness of phenomenal awareness likewise has to be distributed. So you can't explain the dynamics of consciousness and agency within one kind of horizontal ontological level. Mathematically, like higher dimensional spaces can enclose, or rather, let's say higher dimensional being like a fewer number of dimensions, and then lower dimensional being more dimensions. Maybe I'm getting this kind of backwards, but in any case, what I'm trying to say is that some higher dimensional spaces can contain lower dimensional spaces in a point, right? Like take a square in a higher dimensional space that may embody a cube in a lower dimensional space, and then a yet higher dimensional space there may be a point that embodies that square and that cube at a lower dimensional space. So you can account for the kind of unity of consciousness and perhaps the unity of agency by saying there's a higher space, maybe Hilbert space in quantum mechanical terms, wherein consciousness actually resides, and then can like exert this distributed power non-locally in a limited sense. I mean, it's localized within this particular region, but it's like, so that's been my thought of consciousness and the unity of agency. So can you expand on that any more using Langan's thought?
Yeah, I think it's good to I think you could model tertiary syntactors, or they're also called syntactic operators, in the I think that pretty much corresponds to Leibniz's idea of monadology, is that you have these basically windowless souls without physical extension that respond to the primary monad, which is the primary teller, of course, and then are able to respond to that and cohere on that basis. And so it's like you have all these clocks, and it's like, how is there that coherence that allows us to have like one phenomenal reality? And the reason is because there's a much higher, much more intelligent thing coordinating all of the seemingly random events in the universe. And so you can also think of those and so there's this sort of paradoxical thing, which is like, if syntactic operators have zero physical extension in 3D space, then how is there any universe, essentially? Because if you just add up all these zero dimensional points, you never get a manifold, right? And so the way that you solve that is to model these basically as noumena, and then what gives those syntactic operators physical extension is the perceptual syntax of the primary of not of the primary teller, of secondary tellers. And so reality is, in some sense, the it's generated it's generated like a video game. Is that like when you're not looking at something, it doesn't cease to exist, but it has lesser existence than it exists in more of an abstract way than
Yeah.
when
It's
you're
not
actually
rendered.
it's not rendered. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. In Platonism, there is a kind of symmetry and connection between the indefinite dyad and matter. It's not precisely that the indefinite dyad is the archetype of matter, because matter doesn't, strictly speaking, have an archetype for later Neoplatonism, at least. But you mentioned with the primary teller that there's the unbounded aspect and the bounded aspect, and that sounds like the monad being the bound and then the indefinite dyad being the unbounded. So I wonder, is there a connection between the unbounded aspect of the primary teller and then that material nature? Matter in Neoplatonism, and I think for Plato himself, is a slipping away from being into non-being. It is the generation of interval. It is the pure recipient. These are some of the terms that are thrown around with the idea of matter. But it's like the ultimate receptacle of form at the last extreme, the very bottom of the ontological hierarchy. So like we have these tertiary syntactor, or what are they called? Syntactors or
Syntactic operators.
syntactic operators. These tertiary ones anyway, and they are formal properties, but they have to subsist in something, and something has to account for how they kind of generate that separation in space. You referred to our participation in the perceptual process as giving rise to that separation and rendered state. But is there a way to connect to that, like, principle of matter in the Platonic sense as the receptacle, and also the principle of differentiation in space, separation in space? Matter is also, by the way, just called space in Pythagoreanism. So, is there a connection between that principle and unbounded telesis in the CTMU?
Yeah, I think the simplest way to conceptualize this in the parlance of Platonism would be that syntactic operators together form what's called, they're the points in a conspansive manifold, which is essentially a mathematical structure that tracks the evolution of reality over time, and the evolution of the manifold is then the same as the evolution of reality. So it's essentially the real universe's self-model for how it evolves. And so then what what the world of forms then is doing is not actually generating the world, but but as in I believe in Platonism, this is the idea of the demiurge, is that it's like rearranging pre-existing matter. And so essentially you have these higher order forms, what's called like telons, is these global intentions that are formed either by primary or secondary tellers, that then act on the conspansive manifold in order such that you get some in order such that the events of the universe can then correspond to the global intentions that are governing it. If that I don't know if that made any sense, but
I think I get what you're saying there, but I guess I'm still looking for more on that principle of separation, and space per se. You're explaining the formal properties that syntactic operators, tertiary syntactic operators have, but why render them in space at all? And this is also related to the question that I was going to ask earlier. Does Langan deduce the existence of extensional, spatially extended reality? Or is it just like, well, we have the fact of our experience, of course. You know, like with Hinduism, if you started from the idea of Brahman, the absolute, and dealt with these theological notions, I don't know that you would necessarily derive the necessity of spatiotemporal existence. Like, why can't Hilbert space, with the combination of all the quantum wave functions, why can't that just be exhaustive of reality? You know, why does there also need to be classical space? So is there an explanation for the fact of spatial separation and why it's necessary?
That's a good question. I'm again kind of speculating here. What I'd say is that there's something to being physically embodied and being a freely choosing thing which can't be modeled without separate existence from the primary teller. If this was all happening internally to the primary teller, which it is in a certain sense, but if there was no separation and this was just like a program run, like there's a mathematical model of, you know, Eric and I are going to interact in this way and it's going to keep happening like that, is I think there would be something missing. Like, this is one of the things which I think has come up a lot in artificial intelligence research, is that in order to have perception and cognition, you really need, or even any semblance of that in terms of like machine vision and whatnot, you really have to have like embodied, like a physically embodied thing, rather than this kind of abstract algorithm which is just running on the hardware of a thing that isn't actually doing anything. So I guess my best answer to that, and I should have a better answer, but is that somehow the world soul like has to create and generate an actual physical reality that is actually separate from the one, is separate from the primary teller, in order that we can actually have free choice to exist and interact with the world. And if there wasn't this kind of self contraction of the primary teller that kind of removes itself from actually affecting reality, then there wouldn't be any way in which we could have free will. So I think there's some intrinsic connection, I haven't spelled this out yet, between physical embodiment and free will. And free will is needed for reality, and a reality without free will doesn't have any purpose for its representation.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Another way, maybe, of tackling it would be to say that if reality were just Hilbert space, the thing about wave functions is that they stack seamlessly. So there's no principle of separation separating out the various possible timelines. And so if we want to draw temporal evolution, that necessitates this spatial parameter which doesn't allow the wave functions to stack. They can't all just, there has to be a principle of separability in order for time to be there, and time is one possible intelligible structure. It's like the forms are eternal, but souls are also eternal in their essence and necessary beings, because there's different ways of moving through the forms, different ways of perceiving aspects of the forms. The souls allow reality to aspectualize the forms and see how they relate to each other, and also, I would say, ultimately give content to the forms. And I agree with Langan on this. It's not just that the forms project downwards and they're totally separate. I mean, they are more ultimate, I think, than extensional reality, terminal reality. But if you didn't have all of the instantiations, exactly what the forms were would be unclear. when the Neoplatonists define like what makes one form distinct from another form, they'll say that, well, one form does contain all the other forms, because you could say that they're in somewhere like Hilbert space, where likewise they're all very unitive. They stack. They're like joined together more than corporeal things are joined together. They're not spatially separate, so they're all kind of jumbled together. But one form is distinguishable because it emphasizes the way in which it reflects all the other forms in a signature fashion. So just like one color has different peaks in the frequency domain, like it emphasizes one frequency range and then another, and there are different spectral analyses that you could draw for each of the colors, or for that matter, each of the musical tones. So like that, then the forms emphasize one aspect preeminently and are characterized by the way in which they emphasize or de-emphasize the different forms. But it's still kind of a recursive definition, where one form is defined as how it relates to all the other forms. But it's not just that, it's also the causal potential that it has downward. It's not just how it reflects its peers and how it manifests principles superior to itself. So forms are also characterized by, like, are they in the column of the indefinite dyad more or the monad more? Are they more limiting or more unlimited? There's also downward, what causal powers do they have? What creatures ultimately are affected by them? And if you don't have those like separated finite temporal experiences all the way down to perceptions of specific syntactic operators, specific material bodies and material forms, and then also particular like mistakes that souls make and like illusory experiences, if that all didn't exist, then we wouldn't have a full definition of the form. So for the form to be what it is, it has to really have all those causal powers. And, you know, to my mind, I'm kind of with Aristotle, a potential isn't a real potential unless it's actualized eventually. You know, so the causal powers of the forms wouldn't be there unless all the other orders were. Just to give another way of tackling that question, why spatiotemporal reality, why separate existence, and so forth. Free will is a good teleological explanation, though, as well. So maybe we can start wrapping, because this is a very dense material. Let's not go on too long and torture the audience with it. But yeah, where is it all headed? Why do we have this free will? What is God trying to teach us? Or kind of what's the point and what's the goal at the end of the day?
Yeah, so I think to understand like what's the goal, I think you do have to think about that relationship between the formal and the manifest. Is that and here, you know, this is one of the things Aristotle talks about in metaphysics, is that you can is that basically he comes up with like, you can't just have like these discrete like categories of forms, like this is the form of cats and this is the form of triangles, because there's infinitely subdividable categories, but in which you could put those. And so essentially the syntax that generates a thing is coupled with the instantiation of a thing. And so what reality is doing is, it's not the form isn't determining the content, and the content isn't determining the form. It's adapting on the fly through the neither random nor deterministic, but the self-determining choices of its secondary tellers. And somehow so then it's able to kind of have this self-generated freedom, whereby it's evolving towards a goal. And the goal is, you know, tautologically, you can just say it's the self-exploration and self-identification of the primary teller. But to go further than that, I think it's helpful to think of what is the goal in terms of human beings. And essentially, if there is one ultimate shared reality, then the goal should essentially be something akin to love, which is like the expansion of your identity to include others' identities, and that to do that as far as possible. And once you've done that, to the extent that is possible with the entirety of the reality system, and you're taking into account every single perspective of every single person across time, then you get to something approaching what is the purpose of reality. And so it sounds like really sappy, but it's like the purpose is intelligent unity, because we essentially, it's the idea is like we have to it's a it's a test in a certain sense to see, there are all these material things which turn us away from the ultimate purpose and the ultimate reality, etc. And then for us, the purpose is actually to realize that actually all of those things are illusory, and it's just to see essentially for reality, like what it's striving towards the is for all of the separate souls, all of the separate individuals, to realize their essential basis in unity and cohere on that basis. And then that dissolves the distinction between the many and the one, between Atman and Brahman. So this is one of the things that I saw on a podcast, a meditation teacher said, is that, which resonated with me. This was actually maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, but that like the one becomes multiple for the joy of becoming one again. And so it's that everything flows from the ultimate reality and then has to arduously find its way back to that. And the way we do that as humans is essentially through just basically the same. It's basically the same as classical ethics, but then you can think at bigger levels of like, what is the purpose, what is the ultimate end of like star systems or galaxies or life. And so it's essentially just like a very generalized version of ethics, but like the purpose at our scale is essentially the golden rule, which is like to treat others as you would want to be treated, and to think of yourself because we are the same expression of that one identity, and therefore there's no actual the self is not just me, but is all of reality and all of other human beings, and to evolve peacefully at all of our levels of what's called stratified identity. So we have to respect us. So we have to respect and support all of our different levels of which we belong to, our as an individual, as family, community, our race, humanity, and ultimate reality. And to peacefully exist on all of those levels is like the ultimate goal.
Right. Yeah, as Proclus says, all union qua union is a good, because the one is ultimately the good. The primary uh, telor is all things joined into one. And let me approach it this way, just to re-articulate and view it in a different perspective, what you were saying. So that unity is the tightest possible kind of unity that seminally contains all things. For that unity to subsist in some sense, it does have to proceed out to the different aspects of that unity. So as it goes into the different forms have to be related to each other and joined in union. The gods have to be friends of one another. And then for those gods to be friends, for those parameters of the primary telor to be friends, we have to see how they aspectualize and what causal powers they are capable of exerting. Because the form of beauty doesn't know the form of justice unless it knows all just things, and vice versa. The form of justice has to know somehow all beautiful things. So they each have to process downward and continue this aspectualization. Like Socrates says many times in the dialogues, if you want to know the true art of something, you have to be capable at the same time of being like the most errant in its exercise. Like the person who can give the most wrong math problems or answers is the person who knows math the best, because the person who doesn't know math may accidentally give the right answer. So it's entailed in knowing the truth that you have the full measure of all the possible deviations from the truth. So to know justice, you have to also know injustice. So all of these secondary tellers have to explore all of those possibilities to kind of do the brute force calculation of the nature of the forms in their myriad instantiations. And then, like, once we've done that, we're exploring this space, there are particular new ways that we can recombine, and you can do that in a concatenous way where you just say, oh, unity is the first principle, let's just go straight for that. But that would ignore the fact that you went through various levels of, like, degradation away from the more eternal, away from the more formal, on your way down here. And so you have to return by those same levels, again, as Proclus says. So you don't just join in union with anybody. You join in union with those who share these formal characteristics at various levels. You have different responsibilities to different people, and ultimately you join your will to the will of the primary tellor, and that looks a certain way, and it leads to the greatest unity, right? Not everything that appears to be unification is actually ultimately contributing to that kind of end goal of cosmic unification, which we might see as like the kind of eschatological endpoint of all of this, kind of the global universal self-realization, self-actualization, where the whole universe knows the CTMU and teaches itself the CTMU or something like that. Is that the endpoint, or what's the eschaton?
I think that is essentially the endpoint. Is, not specifically the current formulation and the current words of the CTMU, but is that all the CTMU is structured in such a way that, like, all of the further explications of it, because it's just positing itself as a broad framework, all of the further explications of it are sublanguages of the original theory. And so it's the fuller and fuller self-knowledge of the reality system through, essentially essentially secondary tellers working to unify and harmonize all of the different, forms of, like, we have beauty and justice and brotherly love. And if you can bring all those together and bring everything that serves the primary teller into one unity and find its essence in, and basically it's kind of actually like, moksha or nirvana, because it's like but it's something bigger than that. It's like, by dissolving your individual identity and dissolving the individual identity of everything in creation, it somehow strengthens that individual identity. And there's this continuous process whereby your personal identity, even though it's fully one with God, basically, is fortifying and continually renewing the self-identification of the primary teller. And so you are engaged, and so the task, I guess, is to engage everything in the world in the process of creation.
Hey, that's good stuff. Like in Proclus on the Timaeus, and I think in the Timaeus itself, ultimately we are part of this same kind of process of cosmogenesis and world rejuvenation also. So we have that to look forward to. So yeah, this is good stuff. Do you want to refer the audience to anything in particular besides your YouTube channel?
No, not right now. I had one question, like, on the topic of planetary unity, to take a slightly different tack from, like, metaphysics. Is like, I recently did a video.
Stop tapping your table because the mic is picking
Oh,
up
yeah.
loud.
Oh, sorry, my bad. I recently did a thing on the on kind of a message to the online right, and I guess that you're kind of in that group. Is like, what do you see as the biggest problems preventing planetary unification, like, now?
I don't know if I can answer that and stay on YouTube.
Oh, in the most PG.
Fractional reserve banking, central banking. We need sound money. We need peoples to have authentic freedom, and with the banking system we have and with who controls it, we can't have freedom. And so, people who are enslaved, in debt slavery as we have it, by this kind of global parasitical class, are going to be struggling against one another by necessity. So we can't have this. And also, our economic model of infinite growth, which is obviously materially unsustainable in the not too distant future, that is necessitated by the global financial paradigm. So we need to break the thought control that that paradigm has. It's only because people believe in fiat currency and fractional reserve banking, etc., that it has power. And unfortunately, that's wrapped up in our political systems as well. So we would need political revolution. But I think the entire like political, economic apparatus at work in the world today is fundamentally satanic. That's why, in the Bible it says that Jesus says that Satan is the ruler of this world at the moment. I think that's still true. The satanic principle is parasitical, and Langan's fully conscious of that kind of parasitical divergence. I forget what he calls it, but
Yeah.
I think that is the fundamental problem. It's not like I think the other problems of like communities aligning and fixing the problems they have where marriage rates go back up, divorce rates go down, drug use goes down, like all that stuff will kind of resolve itself more or less naturally because people naturally seek the good, the beautiful, the just, the true, but they can't do that when they're in this kind of inescapable rat race, a maze that was designed by a parasitical elite in order to degrade us.
Yeah, just wanted to spice up the recording a little bit, give the people what they want. The
Yeah. The us versus them. Yeah, there's a them, but we can't exactly name them all the time. So we'll end it here. So check out Tommy's channel, CTMU Singularity, for some more big-brained videos. And yeah, we'll, I guess, follow this up at some point with more developments in your thinking. Whenever you want to come back on, just let me know. We can explore some more stuff. So
amazing.
all right.
Sounds
Take
good.
care,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you for watching. God bless.